So, Article 3, forbidding of torture. And the first thing you need to know is that this article uses a Kantian approach, meaning it's not what you did, it's what you meant by what you did. This is a very large or very big generalization of what Kant was trying to say with his ideas. It's just that some ideas are very good and so in line with axioms that you can't deny that they're true. Sometimes it really is about what you meant. Now, in this case, we're using it as a constitutional means to give away the right words to excuse the action of torture, in cases which we should hope were only done as totally necessary. Now, for understanding when this article maybe doesn't become in line with torture, it's still good to know that it's usually going to end up in the case of being in another article. Usually, I think it's Article 8, due to the right to a private life usually being what is being breached if you're not reaching levels of torture. So, if you, as you can see, go off the Kantian approach, it helps you differentiate two different types of actions. You have then your torture, which is ill intent, which follows along with the lines of Kant's thinking, and then inhumane treatment, meaning non-ill intent, and has to be tested through proportionality and necessity test, meaning you could still find a case of non-ill intent directly from just asking the question to oneself, but still finding it torturous because, well, maybe let's say you cut someone's arm off, but you didn't say, you can't prove that you meant anything bad by it. Well, if it's that disproportionate, it still has to be torture. Moving on, Jalloh v. Germany and Austria, blah, blah, blah. A bunch of names versus the Czech Republic. This was just a question of medicine use. I'm pretty sure this was the case of... these were two different cases. You had one case where the usage of medicine was done in ways which wanted to get information out of people, while the other situation wanted to see if a person could argue that a state or then a hospital could be in breach by this is just cases of torture. I'm sorry. That would be Article 8 I was thinking about a case, sorry guys. I was thinking about a case where a guy was asking if a hospital could lie about the dangers and the implications of doing certain things, and that person wanted to say that they couldn't implicate these things to make me believe it, while the court said, no, they can. It's your own fault if you listen. But that's another case. But yes, medicine used as a means to get information out of a person, that's unallowed. And it also goes back to the idea of ill intent. If you're giving someone medicine to get information out of them, well, that's torture. Soviet Turkey, also Article 5. Yes, this was a case of someone who was tortured. I read somewhere that it was a Palestinian method, which I don't really understand what that means, but pretty much they were dragging his body to stretch it in a way which was torturous, which was really messed up. This was one of the first real cases that the court had to decide on, which was old school torture, pretty much. And then you have Remedies v. Austria, presumption about burden of proof goes to state. In this case, it was about prison treatment. Yes, so there was a guy who got some bruises. He got evidence, medical evidence, that the bruises were from the prison, which you can't disargue without having other inmates involved, or then saying that it was before they went to prison. But if someone's been in prison for years, well, it had to have happened in the prison. And pretty much the idea is that a court or a prison can't argue that they don't have to carry the burden of proof in giving evidence that they didn't cause the hurt. Now, it's good to know with the situation of what's happening in the U.S. and detention centers for immigrants. The EU and ECHR both are slowly but surely becoming more loose with these issues. And, what we're seeing is not an adaptation, but a recalibration of the ideas which the US has been able to get through. Most prominently through case law, but also through executive powers from presidents. The US has been able to bring us to the point of where they aren't even close to a democracy anymore. The EU and the ECHR are under the same pressures, and it's important that anyone watching this who is going to be working in any context which has actual implications of rights, know that if you're doing anything within prison systems, especially detention centers which are in the context of immigrants, they're going to automatically get less rights. Meaning, if you want to protect these rights, you need to give 10 times as much pressure in the issue. It doesn't suffice saying that it's a human life, unfortunately. I'm pretty sure even Soviet Turkey, considering with how intense that torture was, I'm now speaking in decades, but it's still in the future where you could have the EU exist in a world where it actually allows for this type of torture. And the only difference being documentation. So a person could still be protected by this case law, but only in the case of where they are citizens, or even native citizens, meaning things such as being naturalized. Naturalized meaning you are an immigrant who has legally become a citizen, and you say naturalized because they, legally speaking, are as if being born from there, legally. Now there are some exemptions politically and so on, but pretty much in the past decades, being naturalized entails having equal rights. The US has already taken away that fact. People who lived there for decades are now either in detention centers or even some people dead. I heard of a man in his late 60s who came to the US as a little child from South America who died in an ICE detention due to the rough circumstances, meaning there is already cases in the West where people who lived for the majority of their lives, who've reached retirement age, probably with an accent and a demeanor which is exactly like anyone else, has died in a detention center. In the same ways where Jews were confused in concentration camps, there are individuals today dead in the past year, actually past 6 months, or if you just want to look at it as the period of when Trump became president, there are people dead who were just as confused. And I know that doesn't maybe resonate in the same way that it should, but it's important to understand that there are real people, just like us, who were taken away in mysterious ways, which are directly related to how Nazi Germany did the same thing to Jews, where most of the people that died didn't have the chance to understand what was happening to them before it was too late. Meaning they didn't even know that there was an extremist movement that was about to take their rights away. I'm pretty sure that's the case for most of the people that were taken away by ICE. It's just important that I bring this up in the context of Article 3 of Forbidden of Torture, because these things are going to start mattering less, unless there is public pressures which try to reverse it. I understand that there are certain ways you need to organize the issues of immigration, especially in a time and place like this. However, there is going to be a toll which only the immigrants need to pay if there isn't some sort of responsibility placed on states during this new epoch, this new period. We can't assume that the ideas we had before can apply to the things that are happening now. If anyone wants to appreciate the times they're living in, they need to understand certain developments have happened and certain politically correct movements have entered their post structures, meaning people are assuming that presidents alone are enough. That is not true. We need to repeat our ideas of how we protect these rights. It's not enough to think that just because the shock of the 40s happened that Europe is exempt. Especially people are maybe beginning to believe this as a defensive argument or strategy for their own sanity when looking at what's happening in the US. But it's important to understand that this could change within the span of a year of how European nations respect these rule of law ideas. The US is the center of these things. They're a post-World War II center idea of what the Western primacy is about. With industrial but also liberal developments, the Cold War idea, the ideological supremacy of capitalism, and so on. These things have now totally been removed. Either you believe this as a myth, meaning you think that the world is trying to take you out as a capitalist, or as a liberal, or as a right wing, or as a white person, or as a man, and so on. While another group understands that the world has lost its damn mind and that people are being abducted in the streets by people with masks who are only carrying clothing that implicate them as ICE workers, but there's no way of actually registering the people that are kidnapping others. This is a way of removing responsibility of what's happening. The only way you could convince individuals to kidnap others is by making them feel insured of their own identity. Meaning if they start kidnapping other people and others are filming them, they probably would prefer that their family members and friends wouldn't later find out that they have been abducting innocent people. So they'd rather mask themselves. But that also means masking the state's own responsibilities, meaning culpability assumes no place. Moving on. MCV Bulgaria, Article 8 also applied. It was about children that have been neglected. Pretty much the case just went into the fact that the neglection was so bad that it actually became a question of torture. And then Article 8 became relevant because of, I think it's right to a private life. Yes, it is. Meaning the state has an obligation to protect the private lives of children, especially if it comes down to the point where they need to be protected by their own parents. Then that obligation is put in to the states positively. Zand and others, the UK, Article 13, right to effective remedy. I do not recall exactly what had happened there. I think it was something about a demonstration, meaning it goes back to the case of, you could probably have, I can't recall exactly what Zand and others, the UK is, but I'm just going to put it up there so that the prompt makes it available for anyone who wants to use the transcript. Anyone who wants to make that a known fact among peers, just go into the Reddit. Otherwise, if you look at Article 3, pretty short, pretty simple. I would say the way you understand this is by seeing it through Kantian perspectives, which can apply in different ways. You can have the case of ill intent of, let's say, through medicine, which then applies to the idea that you're giving someone medicine merely through the goal that you want to get information out of them. That is a super prime example of Kantian thinking, which sort of categorizes these actions. And then another way of Kantian perspective being applicable is torture being done as a means to get information out of someone. But then also the intent to demoralize, minimalize, make the person feel like they're not a human anymore. These actions are enough to be torturous, meaning the Kantian perspective is not absolute. Intent doesn't equal human dignity. Usually, you could have a case of someone not meaning to minimalize someone's dignity to the point of it being torturous. I hope that's a good explanation. It's just good to know, especially with how things are moving today. As you can see, the articles aren't that extensive. They should be in the coming years, and people should be looking out for cases and making themselves made known if they understand these ideas in personal cases. Case law is going to be everything. Soon enough, legislation is not going to work. Instead, courts are going to have to be the sort of system from which systems can less and less care about immigrants. You could obviously legislate, but there are certain rules, certain rights which you can't constitutionally change. Meaning, you could have the idea of a person being exempt from being tortured, and you can have those rights fully instated with their quality, and thereby you use court decisions to keep the quality up, but then you exempt certain people from being part of this right. Meaning you keep people, which you probably want to propagate as well in these processes, I should add, they have the same rights, meaning they are not going to notice the difference. The Constitution is going to keep on protecting them. But then you have case laws which say that you could technically, through, let's say, administrative means or effective means, then give less people the right for an effective case. Meaning you could take 1,000 people through a system which should usually take months per person, but then you do it immediately and then you move them into a third world country, which, if you want to look it up, the EU, I'm going to make a video about this, but the EU is collaborating with third world countries to create detention systems where they can bring usually undocumented immigrants. But then, as people should understand, if they've read anything about fascist and tyrannical and dictator-like systems develop, they usually do it by succession. They have a small idea which takes small steps, but in a larger perspective has taken huge steps to take away rights. So it's not just about the detention centers being for immigrants or even just undocumented immigrants, which is currently the case for the majority of people that are there. But then with time, you're gonna have naturalized people being brought in there. It's gonna stop being about criminals, and it's gonna be more about being effective, making it seem more logical and sound that you torture these people by taking them away, because there's no other way. That's the way they're gonna explain it, which is technically not true. If it were true, things should have changed a long time ago. The fact that you can have people, for example, in the U.S., having lived there their whole lifetime, but they still have this happen to them, well, it just tells you everything. They can support a life, they can make them into their own, one of their own, and even then strip away all of their rights, take them into detention centers, and in the case of that old man, die in a place where you're dehumanized. Thank you for listening.